Welcome back to the Old Photo Vault channel. Before you decide this is just an old photograph, look again. Because something in this image has been waiting for you to notice it. The Quiet Rider, Fort Sumner, New Mexico, 1879. Henry leaned against the horse the way men did when there was nothing left to hurry. The afternoon smelled of dust and leather, and the fence behind him sagged where it always had. Someone had brought out a camera, and Henry smiled without meaning to, his hand resting on the saddle horn as if it were familiar to him. Later, when the photograph was passed from hand to hand, a woman noticed the boy's face under the saddle flap. It was faint, like breath on glass, eyes open and waiting. The horse had belonged to Samuel Pike, drowned that spring while leading it to water. They said Henry bought the animal cheap and never asked why. What unsettled people was not the face, but Henry's shadow. It showed two riders where only one man stood, both holding the reins, both unwilling to let go. The last seat on the bench. Greenwood Cemetery, New York, 1896. They sat close together on the wooden bench, skirts brushed clean, gloves folded neatly in their laps. Clara adjusted her hat while Margaret leaned in, whispering something meant to be kind. The day was cool, the kind that made conversation feel necessary. Someone lifted the camera, and the women held still, faces settling into the expressions they wore for polite occasions. When the photograph was developed, there were three of them. Between Clara and Margaret, pressed into the dark of their dresses, was the outline of a smaller woman, her face turned down as if listening. Clara recognized her at once. It was Eleanor, their sister, buried the year before after the fever took her voice first. The closed door, Plainfield, Wisconsin, 1907. The door had been sealed for years, nailed shut after the house fell quiet. Dust gathered in a careful slope against the boards, as if no one had disturbed it since the last winter. When the men came to photograph the room, they joked about the smell and the cold, and one of them brushed sand aside with his boot. Nothing moved. The house behaved the way abandoned houses should. It was only after the photograph was developed that the face appeared in the upper plank, pressed into the grain like a remembered thought. The eyes were wide and familiar. It belonged to Albert Klein, who had locked himself inside during the blizzard of 1907 and never came out. The fifth worker, Clear Creek, Colorado, 1884. They stood ankle deep in the cold water, pausing long enough for the photograph. Shovels balanced the way they always were at midday. Thomas laughed at something no one remembered later, and Anna kept her skirts lifted just enough to stay dry. It was an ordinary interruption, the sort of thing meant to prove they had been there together. When the print came back, there were 5 of them. At the far edge of the sluice box, a man leaned forward, hands sunk into the rushing water, his face blurred as if he had moved too slowly to be captured. Thomas knew that posture. It belonged to Eli Mercer, buried upriver after the collapse the year before. They had searched until dusk and then stopped. The edge of the frame, Hartford, Connecticut, 1912. Edwin Foster set the camera carefully, pleased with how the mirror caught the room and its small comforts. The dresser was neat, the wallpaper calm, the afternoon light obedient. He stood still for the long exposure, trusting the machine to remember him the way he was. Nothing in the room felt unusual. When the photograph was printed, Edwin studied the center first, then the mirror, and felt only mild disappointment. But his wife saw it immediately, at the far right edge of the image. There, where the frame thinned and the light faded, a figure stood half cut away. A shoulder, a sleeve, the suggestion of a face turned inward. It wore Edwin's coat, the one he had lost after his illness the previous winter. The third child, Somerset County, England, 1863. Mary Whitcomb sat straight-backed in the chair, her hands steady despite the weight of the children. The twins rested quietly, bundled in matching wool, their faces soft with the blur of movement. It had taken effort to keep them still, and Mary felt the familiar ache in her arms as the photographer prepared the plate. This was meant to be proof of a good year, a growing family, something solid. When the photograph returned, the neighbors spoke in low voices. There were 3 infants in Mary's lap. The third was smaller, its face thinned and indistinct, eyes too open for a child that age. Mary did not need anyone to explain. She had buried Hannah the previous winter, wrapped in the same wool, after the fever took her overnight. The mark on her blouse, Evanston, Illinois, 1954. They were laughing when the photograph was taken. The easy laughter of girls who believed the evening would repeat itself forever. Ruth sat in the middle, her white blouse freshly pressed, her arms stretched toward Helen as if to keep the circle unbroken. The radio hummed. The lamp warmed the room, and no one thought to look closely at the moment being saved. Days later, Ruth noticed the dark shape blooming across her blouse in the developed print. It was not a stain, but the suggestion of a face pressed from beneath the fabric, mouth open slightly, as if breathing through her chest. Helen went pale when she saw it. The shape resembled Margaret, their friend who had drowned the summer before, her lungs filled before anyone reached her. What unsettled Ruth was not the face itself, but how naturally it rested there. In the photograph, she was smiling, unaware she had been chosen as the place where Margaret finally caught her breath. The woman who leaned in, Bath, England, 1901. Arthur Bell sat patiently for the portrait, his jacket buttoned, his hands resting where the photographer told him to place them. The studio smelled faintly of chemicals and damp wool. And Arthur thought of his wife only because the chair beside him felt unusually close. He held still through the long exposure, listening to the clock tick behind the wall. When the photograph was developed, the photographer hesitated before handing it over. Behind Arthur's chair, a woman had appeared, tall and pale, her face softened by motion, her head bent toward him as if reading his thoughts. Arthur recognized her immediately. It was Eleanor, dead these 3 years after the childbirth that left the house too quiet. The one who waited among the roses, Surrey, England, 1927. She did not remember when the garden stopped belonging to anyone. The roses grew where they pleased, the path softened into earth, and Alice learned to step lightly, as if the ground might notice her weight. She wore a white dress because it was summer, because white felt honest, because her mother once said it made people easier to find. Someone lifted a camera behind her. Alice turned her head, half smiling, her hand drifting outward for balance. She thought she felt another presence. The way you feel a thought, you do not finish. When the photograph was printed, the family argued quietly over tea. Behind Alice, among the roses, stood a second figure, narrow and pale, its outline unfinished, as if it had been standing there for years. Alice said nothing. She knew the shape of her sister's shoulders. The voice in the corn, Iowa, 1919. I went into the corn because it was quiet there, and quiet felt safer than the house that afternoon. The stalks stood taller than I remembered, their leaves dry and whispering as I passed. I wore my white dress because it was clean, and because my sister once said it made me easy to find. I believed her then. Someone said my name, softly, not calling, just testing the sound of it. I stopped where I was and turned my head, the camera clicking behind me while the air cooled along my spine. I remember thinking the field felt fuller, as if something had stepped closer. When the photograph was developed, I saw her among the corn, pale and thinned by light, watching me with the same patient eyes she had the day she vanished. The last customer, Montreal, Canada, 1948. Mrs. Laurent stood behind the counter with her hands folded, waiting for the afternoon to end. The shop smelled of soda syrup and cold metal, and the shelves were lined so neatly they seemed to hold the room together. Outside, Nothing moved. Inside, the clock ticked and the bottle stayed perfectly still. The photograph was taken to record the store before renovation, something practical and forgettable. Mrs. Laurent did not smile. She never did for cameras. When the image was developed, the man appeared near the back shelves, half reflected in the glass. He wore a dark coat and held a single bottle, unopened, as if unsure whether to pay. Mrs. Laurent recognized him at once. He had died there the winter before, collapsing while counting change too slowly. The Quiet Visitor, Sussex, England, 1905. Emily lay along the window seat with her book resting open on her lap. The afternoon light soft enough to forgive everything. Lace curtains stirred slightly, and the room smelled of old paper and flowers left too long in water. It was the sort of hour meant for waiting, though Emily could not have said for what. She kept still while the photograph was taken, her thoughts drifting in the familiar way they did when she was alone. When the print was developed, her mother noticed the figure first. At the far right edge of the room stood a second woman, pale and thin, her dress older in style, her hands folded as if she had been standing there for years. Emily recognized her immediately. It was Aunt Clara, who had died in that very room before Emily was born. The Woman in the Chair, St. Louis, Missouri, 1961. I remember sitting very straight in that chair. My ankles crossed the way my mother taught me, my hands resting where they would not fidget. The room was warm with late afternoon light, and the air smelled faintly of furniture polish and cigarettes that had burned out hours earlier. Someone told me to hold still, so I did. I felt calm, settled, as if the house were pleased with me. When the photograph was developed, I noticed first that my face looked unfamiliar, softer, almost thinned away. Then I saw the second outline rising through my blouse and throat, pale and unfinished, like breath caught in fabric. I knew it was my Aunt Helen, who died in that chair before I moved in, waiting quietly for someone else to sit where she had. The second shadow. Jura Mountains, France, 1893. I remember the ground being cold through my skirt as I knelt to milk the cow, my breath fogging faintly in the morning air. She stood patiently, warm and solid beside me, chewing as if the world had always been this simple. The bucket rang softly with each stream of milk. Behind us, the hillside was quiet, fenced and familiar. Someone raised a camera, and I did not look up. When the photograph came back weeks later, my father studied it longer than he meant to. Beneath the cow's belly, in the dark spill of shadow, there was another shape, too narrow to belong to her, too upright to be mine. A girl knelt there as well, hands positioned exactly where mine were. I recognized the dress at once. My sister Jeanne had been crushed by this same cow 3 winters earlier. The one beneath the lamp, Savannah, Georgia, 1916. Clara Whitmore paused in the parlor while her mother adjusted the lamps for the afternoon showing. Light pooled softly beneath the shade on the side table, warming the lace and the polished wood. Clara stood by the piano, composed and quiet, thinking only of how long she would need to hold still. The house felt orderly, prepared to be admired. Later, when the photograph was sent to a potential buyer, the letter came back unanswered. The man wrote instead to ask about the child beneath the lamp. Clara's mother insisted there had been no child, yet there she was, low to the floor, folded into the shadow cast by the lamp's glow, her face tilted upward as if listening. Clara recognized her at once. It was Eleanor, her sister, who had died in that room years before, waiting for someone to notice she was still there. The Passenger Who Didn't Leave, Lyon, France, 1923. The car rested at an angle in the street, its wheels bent inward like tired knees. Neighbors gathered in coats, pulled too tight, murmuring about speed and bad luck. The driver, Henri Moreau, stood off to the side with a blanket over his shoulders, insisting again and again that he had been alone when the crash happened. The night smelled of oil, stone dust, and broken metal cooling too fast. When the police photograph was developed, one officer paused longer than the others. Inside the twisted body of the car, behind the steering wheel, there was a second shape, yes, faint but seated upright, hands folded patiently in its lap. Henry recognized the posture immediately. It belonged to his wife, Elise, killed on that same road the year before when he swore he would never drive at night again. The weight above the driver, Vilnius Governorate, 1904. They sat packed close on the wagon, skirts and coats arranged with care, the horse standing patient while the driver gathered the reins. Pavel kept his eyes forward, as he always did, mindful of ruts and the long afternoon ahead. Someone called for the photograph to be taken before the light thinned, and the moment settled into stillness. Afterward, the print passed from hand to hand. Above Pavel's head, rising from the space where breath should be, a pale shape hovered, not seated, not standing. Its shoulders sloped, as if bearing a burden. The face was familiar to the women first. It was Stefan, Pavel's brother, who had fallen from this same wagon the previous harvest and died without a word. The doll that learned to sit. Bremen, Germany, 1889. Elsa was told to keep her hands still and her face calm, even though the doll felt heavier than it should have. It rested in the chair beside her, dressed in white, its glass eyes fixed forward as if it understood the importance of the occasion. Elsa held her own doll tightly, fingers digging into its cloth body, the studio air smelling of dust and starch. The larger doll had belonged to Anna, Elsa's younger sister, who had died the winter before after weeks of fever and quiet crying. Their mother insisted it be included, saying it would be wrong to leave her out. Elsa did not argue. She had learned that some things were better accepted without comment. When the photograph was developed, the photographer hesitated. The doll's head had tilted slightly toward Elsa. Its mouth softened, its eyes no longer glassy, but watchful. The fourth sister, Ohio, 1942. They stood in a careful line in the yard, coats buttoned, hair pinned the same way their mother preferred. The house behind them looked newly painted, proud of itself, and the afternoon sun made everyone squint just enough to seem serious. Someone said to stay still, so they did. Hands relaxed, shoes planted firmly in the grass. It was meant to be an ordinary photograph, proof that all three girls had grown up properly. When the print was returned, no one spoke at first. To the right of the youngest sister, pressed close to her arm, stood another girl, smaller, thinned by light, her face blurred as if she had not decided whether to be seen. The sisters knew her immediately. It was Lillian, buried 6 years earlier after the sickness that emptied the house one room at a time. The appointment that never ended. Dayton, Ohio, 1957. Mrs. Collins sat in the salon chair with her hands folded, pleased by the warmth of the cape and the familiar smell of setting lotion. Behind her, June laughed softly as she lifted a curl, practiced and gentle, the way she had been for years. The mirrors showed tidy shelves, smiling faces on hairstyle posters, a room arranged to make women feel briefly improved. It was an ordinary afternoon, safely routine. When the photograph was developed for the shop's anniversary, June noticed something wrong near the wash sink. In the glass, behind the cabinet door, stood another woman, faint and gray, her hair half set, her eyes tired with waiting. Mrs. Collins recognized her immediately. It was Ruth, June's first customer, who had collapsed in that very chair during a perm 5 winters earlier. The dress she borrowed, Low Country, South Carolina, 1911. Sarah stood in the tall grass behind the house, the hem of the white dress brushing her calves. It was not her dress. It had belonged to her cousin Ruth, sewn carefully and kept for church. But Sarah had been told to wear it anyway, just for the photograph. The hat sat heavy on her head, shadowing her eyes, and the air pressed close with heat and insects. She did not smile. The camera clicked once. No one spoke. When the photograph was printed weeks later, Sarah's mother noticed the second outline first, rising faintly from the bodice. A narrower shape aligned too perfectly with Sarah's own. The shoulders were wrong, slighter, and the face within the blur was older, tired, unmistakable. Ruth had died the summer before, walking barefoot into the river at dusk and never coming back. Some say these are only old photographs and tricks of light. Others believe certain moments refuse to stay quiet, no matter how much time passes. If you felt something watching back through these images, you're not alone. Do you see what others might have missed? Leave a comment with what you noticed. And if these stories unsettled you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more forgotten photos that still remember us.